So, you want to open a textile mill in ancient Egypt and supply the pharaohs with their famous flowing wardrobe. The first thing you need to do is forget everything you think you know about ancient fabric. Erase the phrase Egyptian cotton from your mind completely. Cotton did not exist as a commercial crop in the age of the pharaohs. It would not arrive in mass quantities until the Greco-Roman and Islamic periods. The entire Egyptian textile empire was built exclusively on one single plant, flax. And they did not just use it to make comfortable tunics. The workshop owner was manufacturing the heavy canvas sails that powered the Mediterranean shipping lanes, the military-grade bandages that wrapped the dead, and a physical currency so stable it was hoarded in state treasuries. Running an ancient Egyptian linen mill was not a boutique fashion endeavor. It was a massive industrial manufacturing operation that required mastering a brutal agricultural cycle, managing an army of highly skilled laborers, and surviving the crushing quotas of the federal tax collectors. But before your factory can weave a single ounce of wealth, you have to survive the harvest. Flax is an incredibly temperamental and dangerous cash crop. Unlike emmer wheat or barley, which actually feed the population and form the baseline of the ancient diet, flax is grown strictly for money. You were intentionally choosing to grow a soil-destroying weed instead of edible grain, meaning the financial return of the finished textile had to perfectly justify the risk of starvation. We know exactly how closely these ancient owners calculated their margins because of surviving documents like the Itunknownyt papyri. Itunknownyt was a grumpy, meticulous landowner operating during the Middle Kingdom, and his surviving letters to his estate managers reveal an absolute obsession with flax yields. He ruthlessly calculated the exact rental cost of agricultural land against the projected textile output, threatening his family and staff if they mismanaged the crop. He understood that in the flax business, rent was often paid in advance. A single poor harvest did not just mean a loss of revenue. It meant defaulting on land leases while the entire factory floor sat idle, bleeding capital. When the flax was finally ready, the physical harvesting introduced a new logistical nightmare. The plant cannot simply be cut with a sickle like wheat. To preserve the maximum length of the internal fibers, laborers had to physically uproot millions of stalks by hand, tearing them directly from the earth. But pulling the crop is only the beginning. The raw plant is completely worthless until you intentionally rot it. The tough, woody outer core of the flax stalk must be broken down to release the soft, spinnable fibers hidden securely inside. This required an ancient biochemical process called retting. Mill owners had to dig massive, shallow pools, fill them with river water, and submerge the stalks for weeks. The water quickly became stagnant, foul, and highly toxic as the plant matter decayed, creating a horrific environmental hazard around the processing centers. Once the woody core was sufficiently rotted, laborers dragged the heavy, soaking bundles out of the muck and dried them in the baking sun. Then began the brutal physical labor known as scutching, beating the dried stalks with wooden mallets to shatter the rotting bark. Finally, the stalks were dragged across beds of sharp spikes to comb out the useless debris. Now you finally have the raw, refined fiber. But this is where the workshop owner hit the single greatest bottleneck in the ancient world: human labor. Spinning the flax into usable thread took vastly more time than actually weaving the thread into cloth. An ancient mill required a massive support staff of spinners just to keep a single loom supplied with enough material to operate. This labor force was overwhelmingly female, consisting of highly skilled women who drove the foundational engine of the entire textile economy. The Egyptian spinning technique was uniquely time-consuming. Rather than drafting and spinning a continuous clump of short fibers like wool, which is relatively fast, Egyptian spinners took individual long flax fibers and manually spliced them end to end. They kept small bowls of water nearby to constantly moisten their fingers, rolling the fibers tightly across their bare thighs to create a seamless, incredibly strong thread before winding it onto a spindle. It was agonizingly slow, friction-heavy work that required intense manual dexterity. The ratio of spinners to weavers in a large mill could easily reach 10 to 1. The workshop owner had to feed, house, and manage this massive spinning department because the speed of the women rolling thread across their knees dictated exactly how much volume the mill could ultimately produce. Once the thread was spliced and spun, it finally reached the capital equipment of the factory, the loom. For centuries during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, this meant the horizontal ground loom, a massive wooden frame pegged directly into the dirt floor. It required two weavers working in tandem, leaning painfully over the stretched threads to pass the shuttle back and forth. But by the New Kingdom, technological disruption arrived in the form of the vertical two-beam loom. This massive wooden frame allowed a single weaver to sit upright, forcefully beating the weft threads upward. vastly increasing the density of the fabric being produced. The owner had to constantly invest in this heavy wooden infrastructure and secure the highly trained artisans capable of operating it. The workshop owner has now successfully gambled on the destructive weed, survived the toxic retting pools, financed the massive army of female spinners, and built the vertical looms. They possess a warehouse full of finished linen. Now, they must navigate the ruthless grading system that will determine whether they go bankrupt or become one of the wealthiest elites in the empire. The profitability of a linen mill relied entirely on the mathematical grading of the final product. Linen is not a single uniform commodity. It operates on a vast spectrum of quality based strictly on the density of the weave and the thinness of the spliced thread. At the bottom of the market was coarse cloth, woven quickly with thick fibers. This was destined to become peasant tunics, agricultural grain sacks, or heavy industrial wrapping. The margins on coarse cloth were razor thin, relying entirely on mass volume. But as the thread became finer, the labor hours required to produce it increased exponentially. State auditors and mill managers actively counted the threads per inch to classify the output. At the absolute peak of this system was a product historically referred to as royal linen. This fabric was woven so tightly, using threads so impossibly thin, that the finished garment was practically transparent. Royal linen required thousands of hours of specialized female labor for a single bolt. Because of this astronomical labor investment, high-grade linen effectively stopped functioning as clothing and transformed into a highly stable, liquid financial asset. In an economy that operated entirely without minted silver or gold coins, standardized bolts of linen served as a primary national currency. Surviving ledgers from ancient markets show citizens using specific lengths and grades of cloth to purchase livestock, buy parcels of real estate, or hire servants. Because the fabric held its value beautifully and did not rot like grain, hoarding bolts of linen became a national pastime for the wealthy. The state fully recognized this macroeconomic reality. The pharaoh's government did not just want agricultural taxes. They levied crushing federal taxes directly in the form of linen quotas. The workshop owner was operating under the constant, terrifying shadow of the state auditor. If the female spinners slowed down or a bad flax harvest choked the supply chain, the mill could not produce its quota. Defaulting on federal textile taxes was not handled with a polite letter. It resulted in brutal physical punishments, forced labor, and the potential confiscation of the entire factory. To survive this intense regulatory pressure, the mill needed guaranteed, high-volume customers who would buy the surplus. Fortunately, the Egyptian religious system provided the ultimate macroeconomic subsidy: mummification. The biggest consumer of the mill's finest product was not the living, but the dead. When a high-status elite or a pharaoh died, they were not wrapped in a few torn rags. The religious requirement for physical preservation demanded an astronomical volume of textiles. The embalmers needed coarse linen to pack the body cavities, medium grades to wrap the limbs, and the finest royal linen for the outer shrouds and magical bindings. When modern archaeologists unwrapped the mummy of Tutankhamun, they found the boy king encased in hundreds of yards of varying grades of fabric. A single elite burial could easily consume up to 4,000 square feet of high-grade cloth. Once that linen went into the tomb, it was permanently removed from the economic supply. It acted as a massive, continuous sink. The dead constantly drained the market of its currency, ensuring that demand never crashed, and the textile mills always had a lucrative, guaranteed domestic buyer. Even older, worn-out tunics from private estates were collected and sold at a premium to embalmers to be recycled as mummy padding, proving that the economic life cycle of the fabric extended long past its use as a garment. But the domestic market was only a fraction of the empire's leverage. The Egyptian linen mill also powered the geopolitical reach of the entire state. The heavy-grade canvas produced on the vertical looms supplied the massive sails for the Mediterranean shipping lanes. Without the raw square footage of Egyptian linen catching the wind, the pharaoh's naval fleets could not deploy, and the international merchant galleys moving cedar, copper, and spices across the sea would sit dead in the water. The entire physical supply chain of the ancient Mediterranean relied entirely on the output of the Egyptian spinning rooms. The mill owner sat at the absolute center of an international web, constantly balancing the heavy canvas demands of foreign shipbuilders against the relentless fine linen needs of the domestic priesthood. The next time you see a statue of a pharaoh wearing a flawless pleated white garment, you must look past the elegance of the royal court. That fabric represents an astonishing triumph of industrial organization and human endurance. The ancient Egyptian linen mill was a ruthless, mathematically precise factory system. It required landowners to gamble their agricultural security on a soil-depleting weed. and it relied entirely on the agonizing, repetitive labor of thousands of women splicing stalks by hand to feed the vertical looms. On the surface, this industry appears to be about ancient fashion and religious tradition. In reality, it was the absolute peak of ancient manufacturing, weaponizing skilled labor to transform a destructive riverweed into the literal fabric of the empire's wealth.